So this should be running. Go live. Let's see, that says intro day. That's not what I want. Chapter 1, 8, 28. Okay. Alright. Let me see what it wants me to do. There it is. Okay. That looks right. Oh, turn it down. Alright. Go back to my studio. What's currently live? Okay. Cool. Right. Normally I ask if anyone has any questions before we start, but we haven't done anything yet, so I don't know. Does anybody have any questions before we start? Cool, let's start. Okay, I'm going to be going through the book as we go. That's not required from you guys, but that's just how I do it. So yeah. Right, Chapter 1, Mapping Global Frontiers. We're going to be going to roughly the end of the 16th century. Well, I would say those of you that have had my European class, but that would be none of you. If any of you decide to take my European course, you'll know that we end the European course around this time. So we're skipping roughly a course's worth of history just to start this one. Because the European history course ends around the Age of Exploration, at least how I do it. And this one's like you sort of have to start there, obviously. So we start with, so Europe was there and they had all these issues, and then that spilled over to North America. So yeah, you're going to have to bear with me while I try to summarize an entire course's worth of material. But first, we can talk about what we do know about the native folk here in the Americas. Not just North America, but North and South America, because there was this larger spread out culture, or cultures, I shouldn't say single culture. There was a single Native American culture. The current understanding is that Native Americans crossed over from Northeast Asia, which is to say, Siberia, between 16,000 to 14,000 BCE, using, the Bering Strait, which is what the land bridge was called Beringia. Now that said, this recent evidence thing I don't think is in the book. No, it's not. This is something that I discovered later and added to the notes. There is evidence of human habitation in the Americas as long ago as 40,000 years ago. Now that said, that's not continuous human habitation. These groups likely died out before the groups that crossed over the Bering Straits made it here. But that does mean that at some point there were older groups of human, not civilization per se, but humans living in North and South America. So that's interesting. Just a little footnote there. Anyway, as I said, they got here by crossing between Siberia and Alaska in the Bering Straits. The land bridge was known as Beringia because it was the Ice Age, and with a lot of the oceans being ice, the ocean levels were lower, and there was a lot of ice further north, so they could just walk across. Followed herds of mammoths, musk oxen, woolly rhinoceroses, all that good stuff. The Ice Age stuff, you guys know how that works. Actually, while I'm talking, I'm going to make sure that... Okay. I'll make sure that the thing is picking up my voice, because I would hate to have to go over all this again. So as they made it to North America, they began spreading out. I mentioned this to my class on Thursday that I taught another class when I was teaching upstate that was technically a history class, but since this was a technical college, they always wanted to wedge technology into everything. This was like a technology in America course, and it started here. It wasn't just, let's talk about trains and cars and the nuclear bomb, which it did eventually get to, but it started here. And it discussed how the people who were coming across Beringia had spears, and then those who stayed in Alaska, their spears eventually became harpoons, because they would be hunting seals and even whales. Those who went into the plains, they would further modify their spears, eventually even becoming bows and arrows. Those who went further down the Pacific coast became fishermen. Their spears became less harpoons and more like the sort of spears you use for fishing. So it was an interesting, you could say, evolution of technology as they went to newer and more diverse locations. So that was kind of neat. Again, not at all in the notes, but I just like adding information where I can. So yeah, by 10,000 years ago, these megafauna had gone extinct, so the human tribes could no longer just chase them around and, kill one big thing and it feed the tribe for like a month. They had to continue moving, hunting smaller game, deer and the like, and they had to diversify how they survived. So some did eventually start to become more stable. Now, it wasn't until about 3,000 years ago in the Americas, and this allowed for more stable populations, accumulation of possessions. Horticulture was very important here. Again, if you're following along in your book, this is in bold, so it's probably important. And it's actually right here with a definition behind it. So, this simple form of agriculture, first developed down in modern-day Mexico. Because a big part of civilization is actually being able to grow your own food. It doesn't really say it here. I know in Europe, a big part of civilization was actually taming the animals first, and then once they're in one place, oh, we need to actually grow food because we're not moving around anymore. This starts with horticulture. It doesn't really mention the animals. But I imagine since there were wolves in North America, they probably had dogs pretty early on too. There were wolves everywhere. All right. So here is Beringia, the Bering Straits as we see them today, and then with some additional coloring in there to show you where the landmass would have been when the seas were lower and the ice was there. And if you've never seen a woolly rhinoceros, there's a woolly rhinoceros. They're very large and very fuzzy. And woolly mammoth. And also these early villages, I guess you'd call them. Again, very simplistic. We don't have a whole lot of archaeological remains of this because, I mean, it was mostly like straw houses and wooden tools, not a lot of stuff that sticks around thousands of years. But we have a little bit. Enough, they would build things in circular fashion, and then they'd have their fields radiating outwards. Really simple, but compared to, wandering after animals, it was a gigantic step forward. Because it's hard to raise a family when you're constantly on the move. All right. Now, this is I guess you'd say the big part of the chapter, even though it only is a single slide. And because the book only gives us one section, but whatever. Anyway, it's going to have ramifications for later on. So, the big three: the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Incas. These are the big three groups that created large and long-lasting civilizations throughout Central and South America that existed from significant, some of them significant BCE, well into the age of exploration, and then the Spaniards came and did some genocide. But I mean, even to this day, people are just stumbling across temples and ruined cities in the jungle from these civilizations because the crash, the destruction of these civilizations happened so quickly that the jungle just absorbed them. All right, so let's talk about each one very quickly. Again, we could almost do an entire course on just each one. Each one on their own is worth a paper topic if you wanted to, if that was something you were interested in. All right, so 1325 CE, the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica. Boy, I wonder where we get the name of a certain country from. Built their capital, never am good with that one. Tenochtitlan? Sure. Where Mexico City is currently. Now the Aztecs, despite having these big cities and quite a bit of technology, they were still kind of nomadic and pretty war heavy. And they used that to take over other tribes. In fact, there's a map I'm going to show you guys in a minute that shows part of another tribe inside of Aztec territory, and there's a whole history behind that, which A, we don't have time to get into, and B, I'm not actually really well versed in because I'm more of a Europeanist than I am an American historian, much less a Native American historian, so I actually don't have the ins and outs of that. But when they took over other tribes, they didn't just wipe them out like the Spanish did to the natives. They absorbed them into their culture and took their knowledge for themselves. So they used the knowledge of irrigation, cultivation, written language, and integrated it into their own culture. Not entirely unlike, say, Rome. Um, Rome, one of the greatest civilizations of the Western ancient world, but most of what they had was just like taken from their neighbors during many centuries of warfare. I mean, everybody knows about like Rome taking a lot of stuff from Greece, but even earlier than that, they were just like fighting their neighbors and taking stuff from them, literally, even language. So, um, yeah. But I mean, I guess like absorbing your neighbors and making them part of the greater whole is better than just like wiping them out. So, you know, the lesser of two evils. Let's see. Now on to the Maya. Um, the Maya had been around for a very long time. They're settling the Yucatan Peninsula uh, around modern day Guatemala as far back as 900 BCE to around 300 BCE, or to around 300 CE. So that's, excuse me, about 1,000 years of just building stuff. They had cities, temples, advanced mathematics. They understood the passage of the stars. They were very into pretty advanced stuff for that age. I mean, what were we doing in Europe around that time? Not a lot. Rome was around. Yeah, that was when Rome was around. I don't think they had like, yeah, because Rome, whenever they wanted to know what the gods were doing, they would like look at the flight patterns of birds, not so much like reading constellations. Um, by about 800 CE, which again is another 500 years after this, they began to decline. By the early 16th century, which is the 1500s, which is again another several hundred years later, they were city-states, which is much lesser than a large spanning empire. If you're not familiar with what a city-state is, it's where each individual region is its own government. So rather than there being like a Mayan empire, there were a bunch of small regions that governed themselves. They were all Mayan culturally, but there was no overarching Mayan government. I guess you could imagine if like each state here in the U.S. was its own country and there was no overarching federal government, which some people want. But that's not really sustainable on the larger stage. But yeah. And then we have the Incas. They're much further south, down in South America. You can tell by the name, that's in the south. They're mainly brought up because they were also wiped out by the Spanish in a very short period of time. They also built their society on the back of other civilizations, largely in the Andes Mountains. If you're familiar at all with how mountains work, which here in South Carolina we should at least be somewhat familiar with, the Smokies, the Appalachians. Mountain valleys are really good for growing stuff because when it rains, it brings all the soil down from the mountains into the valley, and that's really rich and really good for growing stuff. And especially back in the day, which, I mean, it's just kind of always true, is like fertile soil is always important. That will never not be the case. And they had really rich, fertile mountain valleys. So they put their capital, Cusco, right in the middle. They had highly advanced roads, cities, intricate temples, etc. So yeah, these three were basically on par with one another. I'd say the Maya were probably the lowest on the totem pole around the 1500s because they had fallen, um, but they were once just as great as the rest of them. And again, to this day, there are still just temples and cities and stuff being found just out in the jungle because jungles are tenacious. I'll show you guys some of the temples and whatnot today that are out there that you can go and see, and I don't know how they managed to keep the jungle back. So the main thing here, because hey, look, there's three separate groups, and that's an easy 3 questions for me to ask on a multiple choice test. Just be able to tell the three apart. You know, the Aztecs were the Mexica, and they built their capital where Mexico City is today. The Maya were in the Yucatan Peninsula, and they had a large civilization that, like, collapsed after a while and gradually came back. And then the Incas are down in South America. They're in the Andes Mountains. Just know the difference. Yeah, we'll talk more. I mean, obviously, like I said, we'll talk more about them as the Spaniards come in. So, this is the Aztec Empire, you know, down in southern Mexico. They built their capital near this large lake in the middle. I have things to say about the lake, but I want to wait until we get to Spain being involved because some stuff happens there, and it's funny to me because a lot of Spaniards died due to greed. So I don't know, it's funny to me. So here, I think this is the capital city, or it's just a city. You know, we see today just like stone ruins, much like when we see the pyramids today, they're just like big, you know, piles of stone. But they were originally covered in marble and capped with gold. Like, they were eye-searing. You couldn't look at them when the sun was out, which in Egypt is most of the time. I mean, also in Rome is another good example. We see the statues in Rome, and we just see them as like nude marble, but they weren't. They were painted. They were actually kind of gaudy. They use a lot of this fresco paint, which fresco is, if you're familiar, is it fresco or tempera? Might be thinking tempera. It's a type of paint that uses a lot of organic materials, so it eventually flakes off. So this paint just eventually, you know, wears away. So what we have left today is not that. It's this, which is still imposing. And again, I hope the landscaper is being paid well, because the jungle's right there. Groundskeeper, not landscaper. Landscaper is the other word I was thinking. So here's another map with both the Aztecs and the Maya here. And actually, again, they had a lot of land over a very long period of time. It's just that they didn't have written language for as long as the Maya have, so we don't, or the Aztecs have, so we don't know as much about them. It's very difficult to have much information when not as much was written down. That's how history works, is literally written language. And if they don't have a written language, we can't do a whole lot. It's not our wheelhouse anymore. You can find like artifacts and bones and tools, but that's like archaeology and anthropology, and you can only kind of infer. Also, this shows the Toltec civilization, which was right there in the middle, and that was a whole separate thing. But that's not what we're here for today. Anyway, there's some Mayan stuff, slightly different than the Aztecs. Similar, but different. And then we have the Incans, who were, or Incas rather, just all the way down the west coast of South America, just about. Basically, all of modern-day Peru is just Incan territory. And their ruins are very interesting, very different. They're the ones on the cliffside. If you don't like heights, you would not be a good Incan. My cousin went. She's always going all over the world. I don't know where she gets her money. But like this is they've got the angle up, so you're just looking across. There's like a staircase right here, and obviously there's no railing. It's just stone staircase straight down. When my cousin took the picture when she was there, it was, well, it wasn't technically foggy. There was a cloud going by, and it was like hitting the mountain, which just sort of added to the, we're just on the side of a freaking mountain here. So that was fun. All right. Now, obviously, since this is, I mean, it's called Exploring American History, so it's not specifically the United States, but this is basically United States, of course. So let's move a little bit north and look at some of the groups we're going to be discussing a little bit more later. Mogollon Potters, Hohokram Irrigators. This was later than the Mayans and the Aztecs, and they were less advanced, not super necessary to remember. I mean, obviously the big three are the ones we're going to focus on. There are a few here that I'm going to want you guys to know. Probably this one, because it's a whole big thing. I mean, the Pueblo, they're really interesting. They're the ones with the big, like, masonry houses built into the side of a cliff. I had it last week. What's the name of the, I'll remember in a minute. The type of the houses that are like built, that are made out of the, it's of course not here in the book. Adobe, the adobe houses. Yeah. Right. Big masonry houses cut in the cliffs. They moved south for a little while. Big freestanding buildings, but eventually moved back to the cliff houses after a large drought. Just remember they had the big cliff houses. I'm going to show you guys pictures, so that will hopefully be seared into your brain, because that's just how I learn. We had the tribes in the plains, following herds of bison, because that was the big game now. Their main tool was the spear throwing device called an atlatl. ATL. They're pretty sparse. We don't really have any specific names for the groups, because I mean, when you're a nomadic tribe following herds of animals, you don't have time to put down roots and start a large culture. That said, their little spear throwing device is good to know, FYI. Part of that evolution of technology I was telling you guys about before. We also have the Chumash tribe. This is down in Southern California. They used hunting and gathering as a supplementary uh, food source. Their main thing was fish. Again, this was more from my technology class that I taught. Um, but like there were images of the fish traps that they used, which were basically these wicker or not nets, these wicker baskets that they would put in the rivers and streams as the fish would, head upstream. And, it'd be open on one end, and around the mouth of the basket, they'd have basically spikes, but, little pokey bits of stick or whatever. So the fish could swim in, and then they would get to the end and realize, oh, I can't go this way anymore. So they'd swim back, and then they'd hit the brambles or whatever, and be stuck in the basket. Not unlike how a lobster pot works. Just a long time ago, and it worked. And they were so good at catching fish. Why did this pop up? They were so good at catching fish, and fish is such a good source of nutrition that, according to, I guess it'd be anthropology studies of like the bones that were found, this group actually never went through a famine. Like, the other groups, there would be droughts and stuff, and it would mess with their agriculture. The groups hunting the bison and stuff, they would go hungry all the time because, if the bison went hungry, then there'd be less bison, or if something happened and they moved on, or if the hunt just went bad, they'd go hungry. But this group just very hard to mess up fish. We're doing a decent job now due to pollution and overfishing. But, like, if you're some tribes hanging out in, fishing in a river, it's fine. So, yeah, the Chumash did really well. One more large group to discuss were the Hopewell people. Now, I do actually have a little bit of a typo here. I say that they numbered 4 to 6,000. This was per village, which was unheard of outside of the big three we talked about before. And the Hopewell group, culture, whatever you call it, let's see, this developed near the Mississippi River, easy access to distant communities, southern Ohio, western Illinois, yada, 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 towns of 4 to 6,000 people. This had trading networks that stretched from the Missouri River to Lake Superior and from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian region in Florida. This was massive. Now, this wasn't an empire. This wasn't some single political entity. This was just a group of people sharing a similar culture that had, like, trade relations. Because that's often how we can follow culture and trade before we have actual access to written language, is where we find artifacts. If we find artifacts from, a Florida tribe in Canada, then clearly they had access to some amount of trade. Because I don't think a Canadian tribe is going to raid a Florida tribe. That's not feasible. Which again, that's something that I could bring up in relation to like Celtic stuff going on in Europe, but that's another class. Right. They created these big burial mounds, earthworks, and other cultural symbols. There's still some that exist today. They're just harder to see than, the big stone temples and these adobe houses out west. Because, this is obvious. These are big freaking buildings under these big overhangs, largely protected from the elements. So that's where the Pueblo lived, just FYI. So sear that in your brain. That's Pueblo houses. Oh, I should also mention the folks that lived out in the Great Plains. Um, this was before horses. Horses are not native to North America. So when they were hunting bison, it was on foot. You would sneak up on the bison in the tall grass with this little dude, your little spear throwing thing, and hope you hit it somewhere vital, or maybe the bison was going to win. The folks on the coast often would have houses made with whalebone because they didn't just fish, they freaking hunted whales. So, that's kind of metal. I couldn't find a whole lot on the Chumash, but I do have this region of where they lived. Again, this is just Southern California. Most of the earthworks from the Hopewell are hard to see, so they're really found with ground penetrating radar. There are some here that you can see, but again, they just look like hills, and I mean they're clearly man-made, but they look like something that we put there for like, a golf green or something. But they're hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. This is something, again, this is my European brain. This is something that you would see among the ancient Irish and the ancient Europeans long ago. These sort of mounds. Sometimes they were forts, sometimes they were ceremonial sites. Sometimes it was weird because like they were forts, but in reverse, like they were meant to keep something in, and it was some weird fairy shit that we're not going to worry about. The Irish had some scary stuff going on. Anyway, here's this is the Hopewell sphere of interaction, according to this. Again, this was not some singular massive empire. If it was, this would substantially outweigh any of the other groups. This was just like a cooperative, and they worked together and traded, and it was more or less amicable. But again, this was older. This was BCE stuff. So by the time the Europeans arrived, most of them were gone. So the groups that the French and the English were dealing with weren't Hopewell, I don't think. Or I think there might have been a few Hopewell groups left, but it wasn't the full swath. Okay. Now, time to hurt myself and attempt to do the class that I'm about to teach at 10 o'clock in like 6 slides. So, let's just ignore like lots of history and just begin in the mid-1500s. So, Islam exists and is putting pressure on Western Europe, and the Crusades happened, and lots of war crimes happened. The Crusaders wanted to establish Christian settlements in the Far East. It didn't do such a good job. In fact, the only crusade, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. However, with the Crusaders that did go east, and the few that stuck around, this did push the drive for more exploration. And several hundred years before, in the 1270s, Marco Polo had traveled to China and introduced Europe to all these exotic ideas and goods and whatnot. Largely spices, because before then, European food was just garbage. And for some reason, British food is just like, let's take this food and boil it until it's as tasteless as possible. I don't know. I guess they don't like to chew. I've had British food, so I can speak on it. It's fine, but there's not any taste. But trading with Asia wasn't always, the way to make money, because Italy brought Europe the Black Plague in the 1340s. Bubonic plague, Black Death, whatever you want to call it. Killed about half the population. That was fun. Now that said, Asia and the Middle East, and everybody got some of the plague. Over the course of about 4 years. Meanwhile, Britain and France were fighting the 100 Years' War, which lasted 113 years, and it wasn't a constant warfare, but it was still a war between France and England that lasted more than a century while the plague was happening. And the plague was not just 4 years. It was 4 years of god-awful, everybody's dying, and then about every 10 years it would pop up again. And the adults that survived were immune to it, but the kids weren't. So every 10 years or so, a bunch of kids would die from the plague. Europe was fun in the 1400s. So eventually the plague started to kind of die out. It still cropped up every now and then. Technically, it's still around. It's a bacterial infection, so it's pretty easy to deal with. But it's Yersinia pestis. It still exists. People still occasionally get it. It just makes your lymph nodes swell up. It's painful. It's gross, but you can deal with it. You can get rid of it. Anyway, economies and culture got stronger in Europe. The Renaissance happened. And the Renaissance wasn't just art, which a lot of it was art, but also technology and also making governments more powerful. Spain unified, Portugal got stronger, and they sent out explorers and missionaries to find more money and also more people to make into Christians. I'm trying to remember if this was this was right around the time of Martin Luther. This might have been right before. Yeah, because I think we talk about Martin Luther and then how that changed things. Oh, yeah, religious anxieties. Yeah, okay. Because once Martin Luther happens, it gets even worse for the Catholics, because they're like, oh, we got to fight these Protestants. And, people murder each other over religion, even more so than they had. Anyway, here's the First Crusade. I love these old things when they label everybody. So there's Saladin over there. I can't read anybody else because they've got them all weird. Richard the Lionheart should be there. I love the expressive horses. Look at that horse. He doesn't want to be there. Oh God, I didn't. Okay, so apparently the horses are wearing ice skates, because that dude just got mulched. Anyway, another fantastic example of medieval art. We have this is the Holy Roman Empire, basically Austria. France down here. There's a castle there in the back, and over there's England. What's fun about this one is it tries to use perspective, because you've got the guys here that are bigger, the castle in the back smaller because it's further back, the people down here are smaller, but for some reason the English are all massive. Like they could just step over the walls of the castle, despite being like flush with the castle. Your medieval art was great. Like their camp tents are as big as like the battlements of the castle. I love it. Anyway, here's the Crusades. Only the first one actually did what it was supposed to do, which is to say, get into the Middle East and wreck stuff, and they did. Most of the other Crusades didn't. One of the Crusades actually, one of the Crusades wandered off into Germany and just murdered a bunch of Jews because history. And then another of the Crusades actually stopped in Constantinople and raised that. And Constantinople was a city that they were supposed to be keeping safe from the big scary Muslims. So anyway, there's Marco Polo. There's his travels in China. I mean, he was as thorough as you can be in, the late 1200s. That's some pretty decent travel. Not just like, I sailed sort of around and I've explored all of China. Like, he was all up in there. There's Black Death. Rolling in from Asia, went into Italy. That's where we get the word quarantine from, because they were supposed to stay on their ships for 40 days and let it burn out. But, rats tend to be able to get off of ships on their own, and they did. This region that was largely unaffected was the Jewish Pale, where the Jews were allowed to live within, technically that was Russian territory at the time, largely being left alone, which is to say not really. And there were two main reasons why they were largely unaffected. One, the Pope had decided for some reason that he hated cats, so he told all the Catholics to murder cats. So the Jews, who were not Catholics, had a bunch of cats. And cats tend to make rats not exist. So there weren't as many rats carrying bubonic plague fleas around. Also, Jewish custom has a lot of ritualistic washing, which is to say they bathed more than the rest of the stinky medieval folk and were therefore cleaner. And so they weren't just filthy, covered in fleas people like the rest of everybody else. So they weren't as affected by the Black Death, and therefore were targeted by the rest of the Europeans. It was like, oh, well, you weren't affected, therefore you caused it. Because why not? Here's a bunch of people dying from the Black Death. I spent almost an entire day on it in my European history class. It's a lot. Here's the 100 Years' War, optimal bow range. Everybody knows you send the bowmen up front and you have the cavalry in the back. This is the cathedral in Florence during the Renaissance. This was the first dome built since the Roman Empire fell 1,000 years prior. So that's kind of a big deal. All right. So that's catching up with what all's been happening. We need to talk about Portugal. Portugal's the big name. And hopefully we can get to where I was on Thursday. So we'll be even with my Thursday class, because my Tuesday, Thursday class always gets ahead of Monday, Wednesday. Anyway, So Portugal, they're way on the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain is, if you're not familiar with European maps. So the Mediterranean was under the control of the Italian city-states. They were very powerful. They were the most powerful during the Renaissance. They were stronger than France, England, everybody else. And they couldn't really move into North Africa either because that was also under the control of the various Muslim empires. So Portugal decided to try to get to India by using the Atlantic Ocean. Now, they weren't dumb like a certain Genoan we'll talk about later, and thought they could just go west and keep going west until they get to India because they knew the world was large and they'd probably die. So following the lead of the Prince Henry, also known as Henry the Navigator, he used knowledge from actually his rivals. Because hey, you can't work with the Italian governments or the Arabic governments, but you can hire independent contractors. That's totally fine. So he got people from the various Muslim countries and from the Italian city-states. It's like, hey, I'll pay you if you want to come and work for me. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. So they came and worked for the Portuguese to help them find a way to get to India. Portugal developed a new type of ship known as the caravel. Narrow hulls, triangular sails, which was good at sailing along the West African coast because most ships sailed in the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean is pretty small compared to the ocean. I mean, they still get storms and stuff in the Mediterranean, obviously, but like compared to an ocean, it's not that big a deal. But once you get out in the ocean, especially the west coast of Africa, I mean, that's where all our hurricanes start. Well, I say all. That's where our east coast hurricanes start. And it's real dangerous out there. So they literally needed to make a new kind of ship to just survive the ocean. So, for 1487, again, you guys don't need to worry about these years. I'm just building a timeline so you can see how long this is taking them. They had a trading post and a fort on the Gold Coast, which is where Ghana is today. Bartholomew Diaz surrounded the Cape of Good Hope, showed that it was possible to get to the Indian Ocean by the Atlantic. Now, this was important because they didn't know if the African continent just went on forever. Like, again, they knew the world was round. This wasn't a new thing. This was a thing since, like, 300 BCE. But they weren't sure how far the African continent went. Like, does it go around the world? Are we going to end up, like, in the Arctic? How bad is this going to be? And so he called it the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope is dangerous. I already said the West African coast was dangerous. The Cape of Good Hope is bad dangerous. Very rocky, very stormy, very cold because it's so far south that it's like getting to extreme regions. And there's a certain kind of shark that lives there because it's cold. That's where the great whites live. That's like their breeding ground. I mean, obviously, they're not dangerous to the ships, but you fall off the ship, and it don't matter whether you can swim or not. I shouldn't say that. That's demonizing sharks, but they're bigger sharks than these people have ever seen before. So that's scary. Anyway, Bartholomew Diaz made it to the Cape of Good Hope, but he's like, cool, we're out of supplies. We're going home. We can't make it all the way up to India. And it was the next year, sorry, not the next year, the next decade that Vasco da Gama um, had finally prepared a journey to go to India. So 1497, he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, went up to India, and 2 years later, his ships returned with exotic and, of course, very expensive spices. It's a long journey going around Africa to get to India. That's why the Suez Canal exists today, and why last I saw, 2 ships got stuck in it recently. Why that's a big deal. So yeah. So obviously Prince Henry is important. I'd say the Caravel, if I remember right, is one I use. I think I skip over Diaz and just talk about da Gama because Diaz was like a halfway point, which, not to speak ill of Bartolome Diaz, that was a pretty big deal. But he was like, hey, it's possible. We got to go home. And he passed the torch on to Vasco da Gama, who actually made it to India. So we have a few images. We've got Prince Henry the Navigator. You can tell because he's got a map. In fact, we're going to start seeing, again, it's more common with European portraits. This is just some rendering of a Caravel. There's Bartolome Diaz. The portraits are full of symbolism. He's got this, I don't know what the name of the navigation tool is. Astrolabe, sextant, I don't know. He's got this thing that's used for navigation. But I mean, he's standing in front of a ship. Obviously, he is a ship dude. But if that wasn't clear enough, he's also holding a ship instrument. But he's also got a sword at his side, which implies like nobility, because that's a medieval era thing. And also his fine clothing implies obviously an air of richness, of wealth. And then, by comparison, we have Vasco da Gama, holding a map, again, cartography, travel. I mean, he's on a boat, and he's got another boat there in the background. Like, he's actively exploring. I mean, so was Diaz. He was like, I'm on a beach that's never been explored before that may or may not have natives, but we're not going to worry about that. But he's like actively on a boat at sea, wearing armor, so he's like a warrior explorer, also nobility, sword, the cross there. Where's my mouse? The cross there, here, and then also on the ship. So he's like bringing the Catholic religion along with everything else. So a lot going on. I mean, and even the colors being chosen are symbolic, but that's a little beyond me. If you take any kind of art appreciation class, you'll be able to pick up on that even better than I can. So here again, we have the pit stops going down the African coast, the forts built along the West African coast, where Diaz got, and then where da Gama finally made his way all the way to India. And he's had to stop several times just to be able to, get supplies and make their way, because sailing is risky business. I don't know why this happened. Maybe there was a gale of some sort, but he damn near got blown to South America. Don't know what that's about. All right. Some more Portugal. Gotta keep this going. Okay. Portugal was in control of Indian trade. Had trading posts and extending their reach to Indonesia, China, and Japan. Portugal was in charge of international trade, just flat out. I think I mentioned on intro day that we're going to mostly be talking about Spain. Portugal first. Also, the Dutch are going to be in there a little bit. Before we get to just like it's England versus France all the time. But Portugal and the Netherlands for a little while, right here as we begin. So the Europeans are attempting to expand. Thus, they need more money and their means of waging war, because if they want to expand further in the world, they need to expand their military because they have to protect their ships. But to expand the military, they need more money, and to get more money, they need more greater taxation. But to tax more stuff, you can't just create new taxes, especially back then. You need to expand your economy, and the easiest way to do that was more workforce, and the easiest workforce was slavery. Now, slavery wasn't new. It's been around forever. And, slaves were typically captives of war, payment for death, other kinds of debts. And typically slavery wasn't inherited. Like, a lot of, I mentioned, Rome stole stuff from Greece all the time. A lot of the learning they got from Greece was slaves taken from Greece, brought to Rome, and then just like, hey, tutor our kids. That was what the Greek slaves often did. They weren't like put to backbreaking work. It's like, hey, you technically, we own you, but do like book work for us. That said, the Europeans pushed into the African slave trade and everything went to hell. As one might imagine. Oh, why did it not? Okay. All right, this is mostly just an intro into the next slide, so I'm going to go ahead and move. We're almost done. So Europeans were most familiar with North Africa, which, as I said, were mostly large, powerful Muslim empires. And Egypt, which is Egypt. As they moved into West Africa, they became more familiar with the tribal captives of other tribes because, well, they used slaves like people had been using slaves for thousands of years. When a war happened and people were taken in war, they were put to work. These dirty, tired, exhausted slaves began to characterize how Europeans viewed Africans. So this began to shape Europeans' idea of race, people who were assigned by God into a life of bondage. Christian belief considered Africans the cursed sons of Ham, so the moral impetus was for slavery. And boy howdy, we're going to see a lot of that as we get into later this semester. Obviously, Africa still had lots of diverse and highly civilized kingdoms, and many, many more smaller societies. Some did convert to Christianity. I have a quote here from the book. Alfonso, king of the Congo people, converted and a convert to Christianity, begged the Portuguese to end the slave trade. Merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and sons of our noblemen, and vassals, and our relatives. But, you know, obviously, when there's money to be made, why bother pretending anybody's human? Now, still, this was before perpetual slavery was the norm. Now, I'm trying to think of a way to say this. This was not as bad as things are going to get. There were already a lot of forced labor situations. Peasants and indentured servants, criminals, apprentices, Slavic workers were common in sugar plantations. That's literally where we got the English term slave from. The Irish were very common, especially for the English, because, you know, Irish weren't people. So this was largely shipping off prisoners of war to do hard labor for a set period of time. This wasn't taking whole families, putting them to work, and then when they had children, the children would be put to work in perpetuity. Not yet. So this is the start of it, but it's not as bad as it's gonna get. And if my Thursday class's reaction is any indication, I guess I have to scar you guys before we finish. I found, I guess, some images of Europeans' view of Africans back in the 1500s. I guess this is technically racist, but it's so freaking weird. You guys need to see this. So, the first one. I don't know why none of them, like, I don't know why their heads or their faces are, like, in their chests. I also don't know why they have, like, an armadillo and a, like, lion cub about to show down in the middle of the village, but there's a lot happening here. But don't worry, this isn't the only one. I think this was actually like a show being put on in London. This looks like something happening in London. They just had like big paper mache heads or something. I don't know. Londoners are weird. And then the last one. So yeah, we're gonna get to one where the horse looks somehow worse than all of this. So yeah, European views on things are interesting. Good, we managed to get to the end of that, because the next slide is Europeans crossing the Atlantic, and that's a good point to start on Wednesday. So, I didn't mean to keep you the entire class. I usually try to let you guys out a little bit early, but I wanted to get us where we were for Thursday. So, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.